Hello, everyone. My name is Madeline Hobson, and welcome to my podcast episode. The title of this episode is going to be Intertwined with Misogyny, the Origin of the Weaponization of Biblical Texts. With me today, I have Dr. Melissa Johnson, who is an assistant professor of English here at Lyon. She has her PhD in English, so welcome, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yes. Okay, so first, I want to preface by saying that I am a person of faith, and we are not here today to attack faith or attack people that feel a sense of guardianship of their faith. We are here to do an analysis and a critique of some of the implications of some of these origins of the weaponization of the text. So first, we're going to do a little bit of background history over King James, because that's really what we're going to focus on is his translation of the Bible. So, Dr. Johnson, will you give us a little bit of history about King James and his rise to power?
Absolutely. So my kind of background in this is that my focus is Shakespeare. And when I was doing my graduate work, I became really interested in Shakespeare's late plays. And the thing to know about Shakespeare's career is that it spans two monarchs. When he began writing, Elizabeth I was on the throne, and when he ended, James was on the throne. And so Elizabeth actually has a very long and successful reign. She dies in 1603, and she does not have an heir. The closest that she had was James VI of Scotland. And James has kind of a tricky past. His mother was Mary, Queen of Scots. Mm-hmm. And Elizabeth I had a contentious relationship with Mary, Queen of Scots. Really doesn't have a lot of memory of his mother. But Elizabeth is cunning. She kind of keeps James close at hand. She almost takes a godmother role on when it comes to James. And so when he finally does kind of grow up and understand a little bit about his kind of tensions political position, he knows that he kind of has to distance himself from his own mother. He has to at least give the appearance that he, is not a threat to Elizabeth. And so I would like to contextualize by saying there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we can't know. If it wasn't written down, we don't know for sure. But one could imagine that complicates his relationship with his own mother in some ways.
Yes.
And so, when Elizabeth dies, since they've kind of had this correspondence, and as soon as she officially dies, they send a horse post-haste to Scotland. He becomes James the First and Sixth then, because he is still the sixth of Scotland, but he is James the First of England. And a big kind of question was he going to take the country to Catholicism or keep it Protestant? And he did choose to keep the country Protestant, but he also really kind of styled himself as a peacemaker, as a kind of father figure of the country. And so he didn't persecute Catholics the way that Elizabeth had, but he kind of had this air of, I'm here to guide everybody. And he was very big on kind of guiding people in a religious fashion as well as a political fashion as well, which kind of leads to him choosing to do this translation of the Bible.
Yes. So. And he has to establish himself that he has to build this trust with the people that he's not going to revert them back to Catholicism, which was, a big concern in the time.
Absolutely.
Yes.
There had been a lot of tension before Elizabeth's reign because the country went back and forth. Elizabeth's father was Henry VIII, famously wanted to get divorced. Pope wouldn't allow that, so that's why England becomes Protestant in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And that instability not only puts pressure on him to establish himself as a stout religious figure, hence the translation of the Bible, but also something that we talked about in one of your classes, was this need to find some sort of unifying metric or something to unite the people. And considering women were put in a position not of power, they don't have the power to defend themselves. It was an easy, almost like a common enemy. Like if we can target the women, then this is something that can unify
And this is absolutely fascinating coming off of a very powerful female monarch, right? But he's kind of got to establish himself. Yeah, he's in this tenuous position religiously. Also, there were a lot of people in England who were not thrilled about the idea of a Scottish king. Today, the countries are unified into kind of one entity, but at the time they were not. And Scotland was considered a foreign country. There were people who actually thought of the Scottish as barbarians and uncivilized. So James kind of has to do something to prove that no, I am absolutely worthy of being your king and competent to rule this country. The things that are talked about and written in the judgment of the North Berwick witch trials eventually become the basis for another book that James himself writes called Demonology. And this is you can still find copies of this today in print. And essentially, Demonology is styled as a dialogue between two characters. And it's all about how do you spot a witch? This is what witches do. And interestingly enough, anybody familiar with Shakespeare's play Macbeth, which he is writing after James comes to the throne and his acting company becomes the King's Men, James is their patron, a lot of the scenes with the witches in that play taken straight from Demonology. So Shakespeare was paying attention to what James was doing.
Yes. And I remember this was kind of a light bulb moment for me in your class. I remember calling my mom, like, wow, King James, responsible for a translation of the Bible, wrote a book essentially just filled with this anti-women rhetoric.
Absolutely.
Women are the weaker sex, so they're more prone to the devil, that they would, use sexual favors for the devil, that they would sell themselves to the devil, that they were more likely to be evil, that they were rooted in evil, and we must get rid of the evilness of women. And I just was blown away. And this really is what sparked this interest of mine, because how could such a prominent religious figure have such a deep-rooted hatred of women? And it just blew my mind. And so this is where we started to really deep dive into the class about the way that this is intertwined with misogyny, and how somebody that has this rhetoric and this belief, and they're commissioning, a translation of a Bible, that's going to be sprinkled in the text. And then a reading that you assigned to us with the Demonology reading, talking about the word witch, and the Bible verse, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," and the difference between the connotation of that word being essentially mistranslated in terms of the word sorcerer versus witch, and putting a gender to that word.
I would say for much of kind of history, we have a lot of different interchangeable words when it comes to this idea of this kind of magical figure, or a figure that can perform these feats that James is accusing people of. And interestingly, we should note, James's book is not the first book to talk about this idea of witches. The first text is actually called Malleus Maleficarum. It's a text that is published. That one is actually based on an Austrian trial in the 1400s that was not successful. The women that were tried in that case were not actually convicted of the crime. So it's interesting that the turn that takes. But yeah, James is really putting a point on the idea of, witch being specifically a term for an evil practitioner, somebody who is in league with the devil. And that's kind of part of the definition of being a witch, that you have to have kind of made a pact with the devil in some way. Now, there are men that are accused and even tried and executed of this. Most of the time it's women, though. And both of these texts actually do kind of point blank say, women are more susceptible to this. Women are more easily persuaded by the devil to, make a pact with him and commit these acts. There's also language about women being more sexually licentious. You have to watch women more, which at this point takes on this very specific meaning of a woman. And even today, we think of a witch can't be a man, right? There is that connotation that you would call a man a sorcerer or a warlock or something like that. But a witch, very specifically, it's a woman who has made this pact with the devil and is doing these things that are kind of anti-Christian, turning Christianity on its head in that way.
Yes, which, of course, is problematic. So that was the big turning point for me, was recognizing that this language and the effects of this language, using this information is also how he validated some of his claims
Absolutely.
So yes, I remember having a quote in my notes for your class saying, if he's right about the witches, he must be right about God.
Yeah.
Like using that as kind of like an example, because it was a way of like kind of, as in history for the witch trials, we know that they would kind of force these women into confessions. And if they would finally confess because it was a better outcome for them, they're either going to die or go to jail. So if they confess, then they live, and then they have to turn in other witches or people that knew about the witches. So they would force them into confessions, essentially. And then, he was right. He was right about the witches. So he must be right about other things. And then kind of establish himself as a sub-Jesus form, and which is clearly problematic whenever you're responsible for a translation of the Bible that is not as commonly used today. I know a lot of religions don't rely on the King James Version, but it did have a significant impact and influence in religious culture.
And there are still some churches that still use it. It's still commonly referenced. That's the problem with witch trials. First of all, yes, it's a way of establishing credibility. If you're the king and you bring these accusations, they kind of have to be true, right? If they turn out not to be true, that looks very bad. So the people that are serving him are probably not going to acquit anybody that he's accusing. And the issue with the witch trials is, you have the option of denying the charges, and then you're probably going to be tortured. Some of the torture would involve things like the ducking stool. It's literally they would tie a woman to a chair and hold her underwater. If she dies, whoops, she was innocent, but there's nothing we can do now. If somehow she lives, well, she's a witch, right? Like only a witch could survive that. If you do confess, though, you're required to name names, essentially tell who else that has made a pact with the devil, and it just kind of snowballs from there. There's really, there's kind of no stopping it at that point. So you're kind of, in a very literal sense, damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Yes, it's a lose-lose situation for sure. Yes. Well, thank you so much for providing some of this information. I think it's so relevant, especially talking back to how influential this translation was.
Absolutely.
And it's important to establish that, again, this is not a critique of faith, but it's important to note that this was a very influential piece of biblical history.
Absolutely.
And this harmful rhetoric is sprinkled throughout the text, and you can't separate his beliefs and rhetoric away from the work that he was commissioning and doing.
It's a sacred text being translated by a human person.
Yes.
And that's something always to remember, whether you're a person of faith or not. So.
Yes, of course. Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad to have you on here. I'm so glad I got to have you in class.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.
So to wrap up this podcast discussion, I've invited one of my dearest friends, Bree, on to talk with me a little bit about the modern implications and effects of some of this that we've been talking about today. So in short, to summarize, something that I've noticed, especially in college, but even through high school, is the way that some of these Christian nationalist movements kind of use this rhetoric in the Bible as a justification for weaponizing against women.
With the Christian nationalist movement, it's very prevalent whenever you have attitudes towards women in healthcare specifically. Like, I know abortion has come up a lot, and a lot of people use Christianity to justify why it's wrong. And while everybody respect for religion is very important, I don't think that's something that should be a justification. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And also, too, like establishing the difference of being a person of faith versus using religion as an excuse to weaponize against somebody. So using translations of the Bible, literary text, in a literal sense. Sometimes, the Bible says that men should be leaders over women. So like using those kinds of justifications, especially whenever we discuss and learn about some of the historical texts and how the rhetoric was, sprinkled throughout, that can't be a valid critique if you know that there were problematic translations in the past. So I completely agree. There's a difference between being a person of faith and sharing a value and having a belief and using it to attack somebody else.
Absolutely. I agree. When I lived in North Carolina, I would say that religion was more heavily emphasized probably. But whenever I moved to Texas specifically, because I went to a Catholic church and then I also went to a Christian Methodist church, and the Catholic church is pretty strict, and they have a lot of classes and like just stuff like that to kind of get like acclimated to Catholicism in general. And it's a little bit more of a stricter religion, I would say. And then in comparison to Christianity, it's a little bit more open, but the way people respond with politics with both religions kind of varies, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. Did you notice a difference in the language and the rhetoric used towards women within those churches?
Yeah, actually, with Christianity, I would say the church I went to, the Methodist one, it was pretty open, and it tried to like encourage like diversity and just a lot of like different kinds of people to go. And they try to keep it pretty equal for the most part. But with Catholicism, it was more male-based for sure. And just kind of, there's kind of an attitude of like shame, I guess, that's kind of prevalent towards women in Catholicism whenever I went. This is not the experience for everybody, but that's just kind of what I picked up on whenever I was younger.
Yeah, yeah. Something that I noticed, because like I said, I'm from Texas too, but I was raised in a more rural area. And something that I noticed in that Bible Belt part of the U.S. was that there were a lot of people that held the sentiment that women cannot be leaders. And there's a lot of that belief in Arkansas, but I lived in Iowa a little bit too, and I noticed there were less of that. It was less of that in the Midwest regions. Something that I think makes a big difference too, and whenever I'm talking to somebody who's a part of the Christian nationalist movement versus a person that is of faith but doesn't identify with that movement, is using the Bible in a literal sense versus more of a metaphorical sense. So it's kind of interesting to explore and think about those differences and how they translate into people's beliefs in life, politics, and all of those things.
I fully agree. And I think you're right about how women can't be leaders, like specifically whenever people take that part of the Bible out, because you just see it so much in churches too. It's usually men leading the services, or like even in youth groups, I've only ever had men lead it. So I definitely get what you're saying.
Yeah, and I remember when I had my light bulb moment in Dr. Johnson's class about, oh my gosh, like King James was commissioning this translation of the Bible, one of the earliest translations of the Bible, and had a really, really bad sentiment towards women. He released Demonology, a book about why women are evil, essentially. And that's a brief summary, but I remember feeling like, oh my goodness, like we're making these decisions and we're holding on to some of these beliefs influenced by a text that was commissioned by somebody with these problematic beliefs. And so that was just something to think about and why I started on this project. And it's cool or maybe not cool, but it's interesting to think about the way that translates into everyday life for a large amount of people and our society as a whole.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Bree, for joining me. That concludes our podcast. Thank you guys for watching and tuning in. I'll see you next time. Bye.